So, welcome to the Hound of the Baskervilles for a book clubby type thing. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that, Lexi. I hope you're okay. Right. So, previous previous warnings apply, which is that we're going to get era-appropriate language rather than currently correct. So there may be elements there. And I am not an actor, not even a voice actor, or not a voice actor. So while I tend to do voices, they may not be very good, and I'm not touching the Canadian accent with a barge pole because I can't do that. So you're going to have to rely on speech patterns. If you have questions, chuck them into chat. And I should be able to deal with that. Hang on one sec. I'm having to do this on display capture, so... Techie, where are you, darling? Hello, Techie. Nice to have you, dear. You done? You're done. Good, cool, excellent. Right. My theory of the Buntosaur. So, my plan for today is I'm going to do chapter 1, which I think should be full length. And I'll take it from there, and I can see how long this is going to take. And then I will be streaming Baldur's Gate 3. Just to confuse people, because I normally do it on Thursday. So... Oh, by the way, if I at any point hit the AFK screen and you hear thudding and screaming, there was a spider on my desk yesterday and I don't know where the little sod's gone, and I'm arachnophobic. So it's not that I'm suddenly getting mugged. Okay. If you're sitting comfortably, then I'll begin. Mr. Sherlock Holmes, who was usually very late in the mornings, save upon those not infrequent occasions when he was up all night, was seated at the breakfast table. I stood upon the hearthrug and picked up the stick which our visitor had left behind him the night before. It was a fine, thick piece of wood, bulbous-headed, of the sort which is known as a Penang lawyer. Just under the head was a broad silver band nearly an inch across. To James Mortimer, M.R.C.S., from his friends of the C.C.H., was engraved upon it, with the date 1884. It was just such a stick as the old-fashioned family practitioner used to carry, dignified, solid, and reassuring. Well, Watson, what do you make of it? Holmes was sitting with his back to me, and I had given him no sign of my occupation. How do you know what I was doing? I believe you have eyes in the back of your head. I have at least a well-polished silver-plated coffee-pot in front of me, said he. But tell me, Watson, what do you make of our visitor's stick? Since we have been so unfortunate as to miss him and have no notion of his errand, this accidental souvenir becomes of importance. Let me hear you reconstruct the man by an examination of it. I think, said I, following as far as I could the methods of my companion, that Dr. Mortimer is a successful, elderly medical man, well esteemed, since those who know him give him this mark of their appreciation. Good, said Holmes. Excellent. I think also that the probability is in favour of his being a country practitioner who does a great deal of his visiting on foot. Why so? Because this stick, although originally a very handsome one, has been so knocked about that I can hardly imagine a town practitioner carrying it. The thick iron ferrule is worn down, so it's evident he's done a great amount of walking with it. Perfectly sound, said Holmes. And then again, there is the Friends of the CCH. I should guess that to be the something hunt, the local hunt, to whose members he has possibly given some surgical assistance, and which has made him a small presentation in return. Really, Watson, you excel yourself, said Holmes, pushing back his chair and lighting a cigarette. I'm bound to say that in all the accounts which you have been so good as to give of my own small achievements, you have habitually underrated your own abilities. It may be that you are not yourself luminous, but you are a conductor of light. Some people without possessing genius have a remarkable power of stimulating it. I confess, my dear fellow, that I am very much in your debt. He had never said as much before, and I must admit that his words gave me keen pleasure, for I had often been piqued by his indifference to my admiration and to the attempts which I had made to give publicity to his methods. I was proud, too, to think that I had so far mastered his system as to apply it in a way which earned his approval. He now took the stick from my hands and examined it for a few minutes with his naked eyes. Then, with an expression of interest, he laid down his cigarette, and carrying the cane to the window, looked over it again with a convex lens. Every time you hear this line, all you can think of is, "Welcome, Hiram. You've only missed literally the first 2 pages. We are good." Sherlock Holmes keeps your hours. Yeah, I can seriously relate. I've done 2 overnights in a row, and my brain's melting. Interesting, though elementary, said he, as he returned to his favourite corner of the settee. There are certainly 1 or 2 indications upon the stick. It gives us a basis for several deductions. Has anything escaped me? I asked with some self-importance. I trust there is nothing of consequence which I have overlooked. I'm afraid, my dear Watson, that most of your conclusions were erroneous. When I said that you stimulated me, I meant, to be frank, that in noting your fallacies I was occasionally guided towards the truth. Not that you're entirely wrong in this instance. The man is certainly a country practitioner, and he walks a good deal. Then I was right, to that extent. But that was all. Oh, no, my dear Watson, not all, by no means all. I would suggest, for example, that a presentation to a doctor is more likely to come from a hospital than from a hunt, and that when the initials CC are placed before that hospital, the words Charing Cross very naturally suggest themselves. You may be right. The probability lies in that direction, and if we take this as a working hypothesis, we have a fresh basis from which to start our construction of this unknown visitor. Well then, supposing that CCH does stand for Charing Cross Hospital, what further inferences may we draw? Do none suggest themselves? You know my methods, apply them. I can only think of the obvious conclusion that the man has practised in town before going to the country. I think we might venture a little farther than this. Look at it in this light. On what occasion would it be most probable that such a presentation would be made? When would his friends unite to give him a pledge of their goodwill? Obviously, at the moment when Dr. Mortimer withdrew from the service of the hospital in order to start a practice for himself. We know that there has been a presentation. We believe there has been a change from a town hospital to a country practice. Is it then, in stretching our inference too far, to say that the presentation was on the occasion of the change? It certainly seems probable. Now, you will observe that he could not have been on the staff of the hospital, since only a man well established in a London practice could hold such a position, and such a one would not drift into the country. What was he then? If he was in the hospital and yet not on the staff, he could only have been a house surgeon or house physician, little more than a senior student. And he left 5 years ago. The date's on the stick. So your grave, middle-aged family practitioner vanishes into thin air, my dear Watson, and there emerges a young fellow, under 30, amiable, unambitious, absent-minded, and the possessor of a favourite dog, which I should describe roughly as being larger than a terrier and smaller than a mastiff. Oh, it struck me that leaves a lot of wiggle room. I laughed incredulously as Sherlock Holmes leaned back in his settee and blew little wavering rings of smoke to the ceiling. "As to the latter part, I have no means of checking you," said I, "but at least it is not difficult to find out a few particulars about the man's age and professional career." From my small medical shelf I took down the medical directory and turned up the name. There were several Mortimers, but only one who could be our visitor. I read his record aloud. "Mortimer, James, MRCS, 1882, Grimpen, Dartmoor, Devon. House surgeon from 1882 to 1884 at Charing Cross Hospital. Winner of the Jackson Prize for Comparative Pathology with essay entitled Is Disease a Reversion? Corresponding member of the Swedish Pathological Society, author of Some Freaks of Atavism, Lancet 1882, Do We Progress, Journal of Psychology, March 1883, medical officer for the parishes of Grimpen, Thorsley and High Barrow." "No mention of that local hunt, Watson," said Holmes with a mischievous smile, "but a country doctor, as you very astutely observed. I think that I am fairly justified in my inferences. As to the adjectives, I said, if I remember right, amiable, unambitious, and absent-minded." "It's my experience that it is only an amiable man in this world who receives testimonials, only an unambitious one who abandons a London career for the country, and only an absent-minded one who leaves his stick and not his visiting card after waiting an hour in your room." You feel like Holmes doesn't know many kinds of dogs. I think you could be right. Let's face it, terriers, even I suppose at the time terriers weren't necessarily the pocket-sized. Didn't necessarily go down as far as the pocket-sized Yorkies. And Mastiffs presumably weren't bred to be that big. So, but even so, I mean, we're talking from sort of fit in a satchel to fit in a suitcase. You say unambitious, I say good work-life balance. Yes. It's interesting seeing it from a different point of view, isn't it? Having a career in London was deemed to be a huge thing for a medical man. So going the other way, as 'twere, and starting in London and heading out into the country, yeah, that's an unusual person. Visiting card after waiting an hour in your room. And the dog has been in the habit of carrying this stick behind his master. Being a heavy stick, the dog has held it tightly by the middle, and the marks of his teeth are very plainly visible. The dog's jaw, as shown in the space between these marks, is too broad in my opinion for a terrier, and not broad enough for a mastiff. It may have been, yes, by Jove, it is, a curly-haired spaniel. He had risen and paced the room as he spoke. Now he halted in the recess of the window. There was such a ring of conviction in his voice that I glanced up in surprise. "My dear fellow, how could you possibly be so sure of that?" "For the very simple reason that I see the dog himself on our very doorstep, and there is the ring of its owner. Don't move, I beg you, Watson. He's a professional brother of yours, and your presence may be of assistance to me. Now is the dramatic moment of fate, Watson, when you hear a step upon the stair which is walking into your life, and you know not whether for good or ill. What does Dr. James Mortimer, the man of science, ask of Sherlock Holmes, the specialist in crime? Come in." The appearance of our visitor was a surprise to me, since I had expected a typical country practitioner. "Oh, yeah. London, extremely expensive. Excellent example of that in Conan Doyle is the case of the resident patient, where the client is a doctor who is set up in practice, despite having huge qualifications and being extremely talented. He can only set up in private practice because somebody decides to invest in him and gets him an address, not on Harley Street, but in one of the other recognised streets of medicine. Yeah, the resident patient indeed. That is a definite eye-opener. It's the idea that you can be as good as you like, but without a huge amount of money, not only to buy and finance the right address, but to have a carriage, to have the right clothes, to have the right staff, to give that promotional impression, because you have to appear successful even before you are successful. It's something to get your head around. And it's also a good story. Sorry. The appearance of our visitor was a surprise to me, since I had expected a typical country practitioner. He was a very tall, thin man, with a long nose like a beak, which jutted out between two keen grey eyes, set closely together and sparkling brightly from behind a pair of gold-rimmed glasses. He was clad in a professional but rather slovenly fashion, for his frock coat was dingy and his trousers frayed. Though young, his long back was already bowed, and he walked with a forward thrust of his head and a general air of peering benevolence. As he entered, his eyes fell upon the stick in Holmes's hand, and he ran towards it with an exclamation of joy. "I'm so very glad," said he. "I wasn't sure whether I had left it here or in the shipping office. I would not lose that stick for the world." "A presentation, I see," said Holmes. "Yes, sir, from Charing Cross Hospital, from one or two friends there on the occasion of my marriage." "Dear, dear, that's bad," said Holmes, shaking his head. Dr. Mortimer blinked through his glasses in mild astonishment. "Why was it bad?" "Only that you have disarranged our little deductions. Your marriage, you say?" "Yes, sir, I'm married and so left the hospital, and with it all hopes of a consulting practice. It was necessary to make a home of my own." "Come, come, we're not so far wrong after all," said Holmes. "And now, Dr. James Mortimer, Mr. Sir, a humble MRCS." "And a man of precise mind, evidently." "A dabbler in science, Mr. Holmes, a picker-up of shells on the shores of the great unknown ocean. I presume that it is Mr. Sherlock Holmes who I'm addressing, and not— No, this is my friend Dr. Watson." "Glad to meet you, sir. I've heard of your name mentioned in connection with that of your friend. You interest me very much, Mr. Holmes. I hardly expected so dolichocephalic a skull, or such well-marked supraorbital development. Would you have any objection to my running my finger along your parietal fissure? A cast of your skull, sir, until the original is available, would be an ornament to any anthropological museum. It's not my intention to be fulsome, but I confess that I covet your skull. Or hello, as it's also known. I can drink coffee. I'm a grown-up. So what do we think of Dr. Mortimer so far? Until the original is available. Yeah. The Victorians were very big on original material in their museums.
Well, Kentucky virtue.
Did you get having an interest, but that's a bit strong. Yes. Sherlock Holmes waved our strange visitor into a chair. "You're an enthusiast in your line of thought, I perceive, sir, as I am in mine," said he. "I observe from your forefinger that you make your own cigarettes. Have no hesitation in lighting one." The man drew out paper and tobacco and twirled the one up in the other with surprising dexterity. He had long, quivering fingers, as agile and restless as the antennae of an insect. Holmes was silent, but his little darting glances showed me the interest which he took in our curious companion. "I presume, sir," said he at last, "that it was not merely for the purpose of examining my skull that you done me the honour to call here last night, and again today." "No, sir, no, though I am happy to have had the opportunity of doing that as well." Weirdo. "I come to you, Mr. Holmes, because I recognise that I am myself an unpractical man." "You're a doctor. How does that work?" Sorry. And because I am suddenly confronted with a most serious and extraordinary problem, recognising as I do that you are the second highest expert in Europe. Indeed, sir. May I inquire who has the honour to be the first? Asked Holmes with some asperity. To the man of precisely scientific mind, the work of Monsieur Adaptaions must always appeal strongly. Then had you not better consult him? I said, sir, to the precisely scientific mind, but as a practical man of affairs it is acknowledged that you stand alone. I trust, sir, that I have not inadvertently— Just a little, said Holmes. I think, Dr. Mortimer, you would do wisely if without more ado you would kindly tell me plainly what the exact nature of the problem is in which you demand my assistance. Your day job is working with research doctors who want to publish their work. Doctors are bad at following direction. I can believe it. It's the narrow specialism. Very, very good in their area. Broaden it out. Oh dear.
Welcome, Coffee Streambot.
Right. So that was chapter 1. Actually, shorter than I remembered. Give me a mo for another drink. Launches you straight in, doesn't it? So, hey, can I have your skull after you die? It's the second best in Europe. Yes. It's rather wonderful, isn't it? It's like, yeah, excuse me, sir, you come with no filter, do you? But he found someone to marry him. Our Dr. Mortimer. So somebody loves him. Somebody can cope with his complete lack of social awareness. And it's good to know. Right. I think the next chapter is slightly chonky, but if you are okay with it, I will do the whole chapter. This does include references to violence and threatened sexual violence. Chapter 2, The Curse of the Baskervilles. Do we ever see Mrs. Mortimer? I've read this before, but you don't remember her. I think she's referenced in the portion on Dartmoor, because I seem to recall that they reference them visiting for dinner, rather than it just being Dr. Mortimer, but I'm not 100% sure of that. It may just have been referenced in the context of getting to know the locals. But I don't think she has much screen time, if at all. He was ready to give up a London career for them, so he seems committed. Yep, does indeed. I have in my pocket a manuscript, said Dr. James Mortimer. I observed it as you entered the room, said Holmes. It's an old manuscript. Early 18th century, unless it's a forgery. How can you say that, sir? You've presented an inch or two of it to my examination all the time you have been talking. It would be a poor expert who could not give the date of a document within a decade or so. You may possibly have read my little monograph upon the subject. I put that at 1730. The exact date is 1742. Dr. Mortimer drew it from his breast pocket. This family paper was committed to my care by Sir Charles Baskerville, whose sudden and tragic death some 3 months ago created so much excitement in Devonshire. I may say that I was his personal friend as well as his medical attendant. He was a strong-minded man, sir, shrewd, practical, and as unimaginative as I am myself. Yet he took this document very seriously, and his mind was prepared for just such an end as did eventually overtake him. Unimaginative being a positive quality to Dr. Mortimer. But not, we know, to Holmes. Holmes stretched out his hand for the manuscript and flattened it upon his knee. You will observe, Watson, the alternative use of the long S and the short. It's one of several indications which enabled me to fix the date. I looked over his shoulder at the yellow paper and the faded script. At the head was written Baskerville Hall, and below in large scrawling figures, 1742. It appears to be a statement of some sort. Yes, it is a statement of a certain legend which runs in the Baskerville family. But I understand that it is something more modern and practical upon which you wish to consult me. Most modern, and a most practical, pressing matter which must be decided within 24 hours. But the manuscript is short, and is intimately connected with the affair. With your permission, I'll read it to you. Holmes leaned back in his chair, placed his fingertips together, and closed his eyes with an air of resignation. Dr. Mortimer turned the manuscript to the end and read in a high, cracking voice the following curious old-world narrative. Isn't it a saying among medical students, you look for horses and not zebras? Yes, if you hear hoofbeats, you look for horses, not zebras. Although it's worth remembering zebras exist if you can't find a horse. I think that's where some people fall down. Of the origin of the Hound of the Baskervilles there have been many statements, yet as I come in a direct line from Hugo Baskerville, and as I had the story from my father, who also had it from his, I have set it down with all belief that it occurred even as it is in here set forth. And I would have you believe, my sons, that the same justice which punishes sin may also most graciously forgive it, and that no ban is so heavy but that by prayer and repentance it may be removed. Learn then from this story not to fear the fruits of the past, but rather to be circumspect in the future, that those foul passions whereby our family has suffered so grievously may not again be loosed to our undoing. Whee! That's a chunk to take in. Sorry. Many apologies. I didn't have enough to drink today, so reading is quite dry. Know then that in the time of the Great Rebellion, the history of which by the learned Lord Clarendon I most earnestly commend to your attention, this manor of Baskerville was held by Hugo of that name, nor can it be gainsaid that he was a most wild, profane, and godless man. This in truth his neighbours might have pardoned, seeing that saints have never flourished in these parts. But there was in him a certain wanton and cruel humour, which made his name a byword throughout the West. It chanced that this Hugo came to love, if indeed so dark a passion may be known under so bright a name, the daughter of a yeoman who held lands near the Baskerville estate. But the young maiden, being discreet and of good repute, would ever avoid him, for she feared his evil name. So it came to pass that one Michaelmas this Hugo, with 5 or 6 of his idle and wicked companions, stole down upon the farm and carried off the maiden, her father and brothers being from home, as he well knew. When they had brought her to the hall, the maiden was placed in an upper chamber, while Hugo and his friends sat down to a long carouse, as was their nightly custom. Now the poor lass upstairs was like to have her wits turned at the singing and shouting and terrible oaths which came up to her from below, for they say that the words used by Hugo Baskerville when he was in wine were such as might blast the man who said them. No. At last, in the stress of her fear, she did that which might have daunted the bravest or most active man, for by the aid of the growth of ivy which covered, and still covers, the south wall, she came down from under the eaves, and so homeward across the moor, there being 3 leagues betwixt the hall and her father's farm. It chanced that some little time later Hugo left his guests to carry food and drink, with other worse things, perchance, to his captive, and so found the cage empty and the bird escaped. Then, as it would seem, he became as one that hath a devil, for rushing down the stairs into the dining hall, he sprang upon the great table, flagons and trenchers flying before him, and he cried aloud before all that company that he would very night render his body and soul to the powers of evil, if he might but overtake the wench. And while the revellers stood aghast at the fury of the man, one more wicked, or it may be more drunken than the rest, cried out that they should put the hounds upon her. Whereat Hugo ran from the house, crying to his grooms that they should saddle his mare and unkennel the pack, and giving the hounds a kerchief of the maid's, he swung them to the line, and so off full cry in the moonlight over the moor. Hugo, as we can see, is a charmer who would almost certainly have a podcast. Now, for some space the revellers stood agape, unable to understand all that had been done in such haste. But anon their bemused wits awoke to the nature of the deed, which was like to be done upon the moorlands. Everything was now in an uproar, some calling for their pistols, some for their horses, and some for another flask of wine. But at length some sense came to their crazed minds, and the whole of them, 13 in number, took horse and started in pursuit. The moon shone clear above them, and they rode swiftly abreast, taking that course which the maid must needs have taken if she were to reach her own home. Crow, what at the text or at me? They had gone a mile or two when they passed one of the night shepherds upon the moorlands, and they cried to him to know if he had seen the hunt. And the man, as the story goes, was so crazed with fear that he could scarce speak. But at last he said that he had indeed seen the unhappy maiden, with the hounds upon her track. But I have seen more than that, said he, for Hugo Baskerville passed me upon his black mare, and there ran mute behind him such a hound of hell as God forbid should ever be at my heels. So the drunken squires cursed the shepherd and rode onwards. But soon their skins turned cold, for there came a galloping across the moor, and the black mare dabbled with white frost. Frost? Whoa, that went wrong. Deny it if you can. He would definitely have a podcast. And probably a range of ebooks on how to pick up women in bars. The black mare, dabbled with white froth, went past with trailing bridle and empty saddle. Then the revellers rode close together, for a great fear was on them. But they still followed over the moor, though each, had he been alone, would have been right glad to have turned his horse's head. Riding slowly in this fashion, they came at last upon the hounds. These, though known for their valour and their breed, were whimpering in a cluster at the head of a deep dip, or goyle, as we call it, upon the moor, some slinking away, and some with starting hackles and staring eyes, gazing down the narrow valley before them. The company had come to a halt, more sober men, as you may guess, than when they had started. The most of them would by no means advance, but the 3 of them, the boldest, or it may be the most drunken, rode forward down the goyle. Now it opened into a broad space in which stood 2 of those great stones still to be seen there, which were set by certain forgotten peoples in the days of old. The moon was shining bright upon the clearing, and there in the centre lay the unhappy maid where she had fallen, dead of fear and of fatigue. But it was not the sight of her body, nor yet was it that of the body of Hugo Baskerville lying near her, which raised the hair upon the heads of these 3 daredevil roisterers, but it was that standing over Hugo and plucking at his throat. There stood a foul thing, a great black beast, shaped like a hound, yet larger than any hound that ever mortal eye has rested upon. And even as they looked, the thing tore the throat out of Hugo Baskerville, on which, as it turned its blazing eyes and dripping jaws upon them, the 3 shrieked with fear and rode for dear life, still screaming across the moor. One, it is said, died that very night of what he had seen, and the other 2 were but broken men for the rest of their days. Such is the tale, my sons, of the coming of the hound, which is said to have plagued the family so sorely ever since. If I have set it down, it is because that which is clearly known hath less terror than that which is but hinted at and guessed. Nor can it be denied that many of the family have been unhappy in their deaths, which have been sudden, bloody, and mysterious. Yet may we shelter ourselves in the infinite goodness of Providence, which would not for ever punish the innocent beyond that 3rd or 4th generation which is threatened in Holy Writ. To that Providence, my sons, I hereby commend you, and I counsel you by way of caution to forbear from crossing the moor in those dark hours when the powers of evil are exalted. This from Hugo Baskerville to his sons Roger and John, with instructions that they say nothing thereof to their sister Elizabeth. Well, that's a lump. Does the history seem like an M.R. James story? I would not be surprised if M.R. James had read Conan Doyle. But because it does have that launching off in media res and the forces of the supernatural enacting revenge for somebody on the behalf of someone vulnerable. Why doesn't Elizabeth need to know about the ghost dog? That's an interesting question. Is it that they consider only boys are going to be vulnerable to the dog? Is it just the heirs to the house of the Baskervilles? Or is it that they just don't want to scare her and they don't think she can cope? Which doesn't really speak very well to the father or the brothers. Also, you have to love that they're still using the Baskerville, still using the name Hugo as a family name. That's one where you would really just go, you know what? We'll put that one in the cupboard and we just won't call our children that for a while. You think it's just the heirs? It could well be. If the messages stay off the moor, Elizabeth could easily go for a walk and come to trouble. Yeah. So either they don't think she's in danger, which is the beneficial way of looking at it, or they don't much care and only value the boys, which is possibly an uncharitable reading on my part. This was the story that taught you what the word moor meant. Ah, okay. I have been on moorland at night, and as when you're out in the countryside at night at all, it's astounding how dark it is. We should use a family name for our son, darling. What would you suggest? Let's name him after the raving arsehole. Surely nothing will go wrong.
Welcome, Buckland.
Also, and this is kind of slid under the carpet. The writer comes from the line of Hugo Baskerville. So he's a direct descendant of Hugo Baskerville. There is no reference to Mrs. Hugo Baskerville. How many times did Hugo pull that he was trying to do with the farm girl? How many little bastards have been running around in the original sense of the term? Because there's also no reference to siblings. Yeah, Vila Katzen, you just had that thought as well, didn't you? But yes, he comes from a direct line from Hugo, as he says, and is convinced that the family is cursed unto the 3rd or 4th generation. And yet, there's no mention at all there of Hugo having a wife and kids. So in my humble opinion, I think we're probably looking at byblows through the countryside. Wild oats having been sown. Seems the type to marry some poor girl for the heirs and then forcibly chase skirts after the fact. That, I think, is the most hopeful option. Is that he married and impregnated some local gentlewoman, and, you know, she spent a lot of time staying with her parents, you know? So, yeah, that's murky. That is a family tree you'd be looking at going, okay. No wonder the Hound was after him. Yeah. Alexia, that I just thought the extended true sounded bang on, to be honest. If they took after Hugo, there might be personality bastards too. Yep. When Dr. Mortimer had finished reading this singular narrative, he pushed his spectacles up on his forehead and stared across at Mr. Sherlock Holmes. The latter yawned and tossed the end of his cigarette into the fire. "Well," said he, "do you not find it interesting? To a collector of fairy tales?" Dr. Mortimer drew a folded newspaper out of his pocket. "Now, Mr. Holmes, we will give you something a little more recent. This is the Devon County Chronicle of May 14th of this year. It's a short account of the facts elicited at the death of Sir Charles Baskerville, which occurred a few days before that date." The story is specifically about calling out the lads. The only important woman in the tale is the one that makes you go, yeah. Why bother about writing about the mother? She doesn't matter to the narrative. Oh, sorry, Crow. I did try and content warn. I apologise. Hugo Baskerville really was an absolute arse basket, and if anyone was going to bring down the curse, that's, you know, forces of the supernatural presumably queuing up, going, "Can I have him?" Yeah, I know. Oh no, I absolutely. I know you are very familiar with it. Sorry. Did not mean to impugn you. My friend leaned a little forward, and his expression became intent. Our visitor readjusted his glasses and began, The recent sudden death of Sir Charles Baskerville, whose name has been mentioned as the probable Liberal candidate for Mid-Devon at the next election, has cast a gloom over the county. Now that kind of sets the character of Charles Baskerville very well in just that one line. That he was expected to run for Parliament for the Liberal Party. Though Sir Charles had resided at Baskerville Hall for a comparatively short period, his amiability of character and extreme generosity had won the affection and respect of all who had been brought into contact with him. In these days of nouveau riches, it is refreshing to find a case where the scion of an old country family which has fallen upon evil days is able to make his own fortune, and to bring it back with him to restore the fallen grandeur of his line. Oh, get some rest, Alexia. Absolutely no worries. This will be on the VOD, and an edited version will then go up onto YouTube. So you won't miss out. And trust me, I'm going to be doing this for the next weeks. Get some rest. Sir Charles, as is well known, made large sums of money in South African speculation. More wise than those who go on until the wheel turns against them, he realised his gains and returned to England with them. It's only 2 years since he took up residence at Baskerville Hall, and it's common talk how large were those schemes of reconstruction and improvement, which had been interrupted by his death. Being himself childless, it was his openly expressed desire that the whole countryside should, within his own lifetime, profit by his good fortune, and many will have personal reasons for bewailing his untimely end. His generous donations to local and county charities have been frequently chronicled in these columns. The circumstances connected with the death of Sir Charles cannot be said to have been entirely cleared up by the inquest, but at least enough has been done to dispose of those rumours to which local superstition has given rise. There is no reason whatever to suspect foul play, or to imagine that death could be from any but natural causes. Sir Charles was a widower, and a man who may be seen to have been in some ways of an eccentric habit of mind. In spite of his considerable wealth, he was simple in his personal tastes, and his indoor servants at Baskerville Hall consisted of a married couple named Barrymore, the husband acting as butler and the wife as housekeeper. Their evidence, corroborated by that of several friends, tends to show that Sir Charles's health has for some time been impaired, and points especially to some affection of the heart. I think he's after affliction, but I could be wrong. Manifesting itself in changes of colour, breathlessness, and acute attacks of nervous depression. Dr. James Mortimer, the friend and medical attendant of the deceased, has given evidence to the same effect. The facts of the case are simple. Sir Charles Baskerville was in the habit of walking every night before going to bed, of walking down the famous yew alley. Was in the habit every night before going to bed of walking down the famous yew alley of Baskerville Hall. The evidence of the Barrymores shows that this had been his custom. On the 4th of May, Sir Charles had declared his intention of starting next day for London, and had ordered Barrymore to prepare his luggage. That night he went out as usual for his nocturnal walk, in the course of which he was in the habit of smoking a cigar. He never returned. At 12 o'clock, Barrymore, finding the hall door still open, became alarmed, and lighting a lantern went in search of his master. The day had been wet, and Sir Charles's footmarks were easily traced down the alley. Halfway down this walk there is a gate which leads out onto the moor. There were indications that Sir Charles had stood for some little time there. He then proceeded down the alley, and it was at the far end of it that his body was discovered. One fact which has not been explained is the statement of Barrymore that his master's footprints altered their character from the time that he passed the moor gate, and that he appeared from thence onwards to have been walking upon his toes. One Murphy, a gipsy horse-dealer, was on the moor at no great distance of the time, but he appears by his own confession to have been the worse for drink. He declares that he heard cries, but is unable to state from which direction they came. No signs of violence were to be discovered upon Sir Charles's person, and though the doctor's evidence pointed to an almost incredible facial distortion, so great that Dr. Mortimer refused at first to believe it was indeed his friend and patient who lay before him, it was explained that is a symptom which is not unusual in cases of dysnopia and death from cardiac exhaustion. This explanation was borne out by the post-mortem examination, which showed long-standing organic disease, and the coroner's jury returned a verdict in accordance with the medical evidence. It is well that this is so, for it is obviously of the utmost importance that Sir Charles's heir should settle at the Hall and continue the good work which has been so sadly interrupted. Had the prosaic finding of the coroner not finally put an end to the romantic stories which have been whispered in connection with the affair, it might have been difficult to find a tenant for Baskerville Hall. It is understood that the next of kin is Mr. Henry Baskerville, if he be still alive, the son of Sir Charles Baskerville's younger brother. The young man, when last heard of, was in America, and inquiries are being instigated with a view to informing him of his good fortune. The facts in the case. So, Sir Charles, generally considered a goodegg.com. Dr. Mortimer refolded his paper and replaced it in his pocket. Those are the public facts, Mr. Holmes, in connection with the death of Sir Charles Baskerville. I must thank you, said Sherlock Holmes, for calling my attention to a case which certainly presents some features of interest. I had observed some newspaper comment at the time, but I was exceedingly preoccupied by that little affair of the Vatican cameos, and in my anxiety to oblige the Pope I lost touch with several interesting English cases. This article, you say, contains all the public facts? It does. Then let me have the private ones. He leaned back, put his fingertips together, and assumed his most impassive and judicial expression. In doing so, said Dr. Mortimer, who had begun to show signs of some strong emotion, I am telling that which I have not confided to anyone. My motive for withholding it from the coroner's inquiry is that a man of science shrinks from placing himself in the public position of seeming to endorse a popular superstition. I had the further motive that Baskerville Hall, as the paper said, would certainly remain untenanted if anything were done to increase its already rather grim reputation. For both these reasons, I thought that I was justified in telling rather less than I knew, since no practical good could result from it. But with you there is no reason why I should not be perfectly frank. The moor is very sparsely inhabited, and those who live near each other are thrown very much together. For this reason I saw a good deal of Charles Baskerville. With the exception of Mr. Frankland, of Lofter Hall, and Mr. Stapleton, the naturalist, there are no other men of education within many miles. Sir Charles was a retiring man, but the chance of his illness brought us together, and the community of interest in science kept us so. He had brought back much scientific information from South Africa, and many a charming evening we have spent together discussing the comparative anatomy of the bushman and the Hottentot. Oh, boy. Right, fair enough. As you do. Bushmen being the ones who lived, presumably. Within the last few months, it became increasingly plain to me that Sir Charles's nervous system was strained to the breaking point. He had taken this legend, which I have read you, exceedingly to heart, so much so that, although he would walk in his own grounds, nothing would induce him to go upon the moor at night. Incredible as it may appear to you, Mr. Holmes, he was honestly convinced that a dreadful fate overhung his family, and certainly the records which he was able to give of his ancestors were not encouraging. The idea of some ghastly presence constantly haunted him, and on more than one occasion he has asked me whether I had on my medical journeys at night ever seen any strange creature, or heard the baying of a hound. The latter question he put to me several times, and always with a voice which vibrated with excitement. I can well remember driving up to his house in the evening some 3 weeks before the final event. He chanced to be at his hall door. I had descended from my gig and was standing in front of him when I saw his eyes fix themselves upon my shoulder and stare past me with an expression of the most dreadful horror. I whisked around and had just time to catch a glimpse of something which I took to be a large black calf passing at the head of the drive. So excited and alarmed was he that I was compelled to go down to the spot where the animal had been and look around for it. It was gone, however, and the incident appeared to make the worst impression upon his mind. I stayed with him all the evening, and it was on that occasion, to explain the emotion which he had shown, that he confided to my keeping that narrative which I read to you when first I came. I mention this small episode because it assumes some importance in view of the tragedy which followed, but I was convinced at the time that the matter was entirely trivial and that his excitement had no justification. It was at my advice that Sir Charles was about to go to London. His heart was, I knew, affected, and the constant anxiety in which he lived, however chimerical the cause it might be, was evidently having a serious effect upon his health. I thought that a few months among the distractions of town would send him back a new man. Mr. Stapleton, a mutual friend who was much concerned at his state of health, was of the same opinion, and at the last instant came this terrible catastrophe. On the night of Sir Charles's death, Barrymore the butler, who made the discovery, sent Perkins the groom on horseback to me, and as I was sitting up late, I was able to reach Baskerville Hall within an hour of the event. I checked and corroborated all the facts which were mentioned at the inquest. I followed the footsteps down the yew alley. I saw the spot at the moor-gate where he seemed to have waited. I remarked the change in the shape of the prints after that point. I noted that there were no other footsteps save those of Barrymore on the soft gravel, and finally I carefully examined the body, which had not been touched until my arrival. Sir Charles lay on his face, his arms out, his fingers dug into the ground, and his features convulsed with some strong emotion to such an extent that I could hardly have sworn to his identity. There was certainly no physical injury of any kind, but one false statement was made by Barrymore at the inquest. He said that there were no traces upon the ground round the body. He did not observe any, but I did, some little distance off, but fresh and clear. Footprints? Footprints. A man's or a woman's? Dr. Mortimer looked strangely at us for an instant, and his voice sank almost to a whisper as he answered. Mr. Holmes, they were the footprints of a gigantic hound. And we will leave that there. So, meet Dr. Mortimer and find out the details of the death of Sir Charles, which it forms the bulk of the investigation for the rest of the book. So, I hope people are enjoying that. It's a good end to a chapter, isn't it? It's poor old Dr. Mortimer. Unimaginative man of science, and just going, oh. Yes, I just did you a cliffhanger.